Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be with you in Michigan, and not really in Michigan because our whole world is virtual today. But as you know, my annual trips to Michigan have been fantastic, and there's so many friends that I have and acquaintances, and so I'm happy to sort of touch base with you again, even though it is virtually. I do want to just say a couple things. First about Bob. I want to personally welcome Bob to all of these activities that he's involved with. I've had a chance to meet with him virtually. Peggy did a great job of setting that up, and we've had some discussion from that standpoint, and we've been on some group calls. But I really look forward to working with you, Bob, and really carrying on the great relationship that's existed between the Michigan Association and the AICPA, and I know that's what the volunteer leaders who are members of both AICPA and Michigan want, and that's certainly something that I know we're both committed to. I know that missing Peggy is something that we're all experiencing, and Bob certainly understands following somebody like Peggy is a tough job, but I don't know if Peggy's actually watching this, but I just wanted to acknowledge Peggy another time as it relates to her great career and her great friendship, and as I said, look forward to building that with Bob as well going forward. What a crazy time, right? What an unbelievable set of facts and circumstances that we're dealing with as a profession and as individuals, that frankly, when I was with you last year, or any interactions we've had with many of you during the past year, none of us would have even a couple months ago predicted exactly the facts and circumstances that we're dealing with today. And I guess my overarching message to you to start is that our profession is, I think, extraordinarily well positioned for these extraordinary events. And I think the men and women who make up our profession, their ethical components, their commitments, their quality in general, really is very, very important to where we are as a country, as we are to a global business environment, and how we recover from this. If you've had the opportunity to watch any of the videos that I've done or done with some other members of our team that have been posted on our resources, and I'm going to talk about a lot of those topics, one of the consistent messages that I delivered in those is that, we're in a world right now, we're in a point of time right now that clearly is not only unusual but opportunistic, and not in a negative sense, but in an importance of our profession sense. Medical professionals have been phenomenal, and they've been on the front lines of keeping us as healthy as possible. But as we now shift to an era of economic recovery, our skills will be the same, are needed the same way as the medical professional skills were on the health side. Restoring our economy to health, restoring our business cultures to health, restoring our own confidence economically as individual investors to health will be critically important to how quickly this recovery actually occurs. And if you take nothing else away, and I look forward to doing Q&A at the end of this time frame with you, but if you take nothing else away, I think living every day for now, for as long as we can foresee, with that mindset as a member of our profession, I think is absolutely essential. And I hope with some of the things that I'm going to cover that it will reinforce exactly that thinking. Just to sort of set the stage, obviously people are worried. When you think about, and this is a couple of weeks old now, so these statistics have probably changed, but 48% are worried about financial harm. I'm surprised it's not higher. And a quarter of workers think it's likely that they will get laid off in the next year. And hopefully we won't get to that high. We're obviously very high. But hopefully the series of business interactions, I think including the business interactions with our profession, the work of programs from government, and that positive mental attitude can make the ceiling quite a little bit lower than that, but more importantly, make the recovery faster. So clearly, we live in a world that is phenomenally, questioning where everything is heading, and that is true. And many of you live in, obviously Detroit area has been a hot spot, so to speak. There are several hot spots around, and obviously, each state is reacting differently. And as we watch the news, and we probably get tired of watching the news each night, it's a critical component there. I think as we think about this, the trust point is important. For those of you who have heard me speak in the past, I always talk about trust being a critical calling card for our profession. And for goodness sakes, we have a lack of trust today, because it's very hard to figure out what to trust. And clearly, there is this sort of overwhelming lack of trust for the media today. You've heard me talk about that. And it doesn't really matter where you are on the political spectrum. There is a lack of trust in what comes out through the media process. And something that the media, if we think back a few decades, that the media really had as sort of a really, really significant calling card for themselves, has certainly, because of a lot of reasons, the internet being a major part of it, has certainly dissipated. And, as I look at it from our profession standpoint, and I think about our ability to be that objective advisor, whether we work for a company or whether we're in public accounting or whether we're in academia, the trusted advisor is so critical, such a critical component, and never more critical than in times like this. In healthy times, in times when things are moving, obviously they're moving fast today, but extraordinarily fast in a positive way, the room for error is greater, frankly. And the room for error today is a lot narrower. And so our trust perspective is a critical component of what we bring to the business world today. And so I think as you think about just the walk in the shoes of the people who are, really suffering most, and also think about the trust component to help them come out of that, I think are really two critical components for the profession to speak about. One of the things that we point to is about being the trusted advisor. And listen, if you're auditing public companies, there's a different context of what trusted advisor means or can mean because of independence rules. But for the most part, our profession, 44,000 firms, in this country, 425,000 men and women working in businesses and in firms. The most part, they're that trusted advisor. They're the people who can step back, who can be, I think, forward-looking and not just overly conservative, but put the pieces together, think in a systems environment to help make better decision-making. This is an inflection point. This is our opportunity to really prove those words, trusted advisor, to really prove that word, trust, in the world today. People will remember some of the things that I have said to firms, and I've talked to many, many, many leaders of firms and a lot of seminars and virtual programs. But, one of the things that I say about the client-firm relationship is this is the opportunity to create 20-year clients. This is the opportunity to cement a next generation of leadership and build a 20-year client relationship. The things we do today, how we go about them, how accessible we are, how we're positioning them, how we're reacting are critically important. And likewise in our business and industry component, how we step up, how we get business leaders that we work for or work with to make the right decisions, how we come up with the creative ideas. These are the things that are really an inflection point for us today. And there isn't a sort of a simple answer to any one of those things. It requires judgment, and it requires us, I think, to really step back and get away from, the 17 subchapters in a tax code or the detailed rules that we expect in certain compliance aspects of accounting and auditing and the like, and to think at a different level. And I would challenge all of us as we think about some of these issues that I'm going to cover, as we think about those, to really be at that different level. And I'll talk about the PPP program here in a moment, but it's been amazing to me how so many of our members just want the precise answers instead of, embracing some of the uncertainty and the flexibility that allows us to be that trusted advisor to a particular client facing a decision that they might have to make. And I think as we reflect back on today's times, we have been, as state societies, as the AICPA, as firm leaders, we have been all about the fast pace of change and technology, re-engineering our profession, rethinking our profession. None of those things go away. And I'm going to talk about some of the things we're pushing, continuing, and not taking the pedal off, the gas off those issues, because we cannot just stop everything. But at the same time, this notion of competencies and skill sets to think in a more systemic way and make the right types of decisions as opposed to just the precise answers. We used to talk about that in the context that that's where technology can displace us as a profession. That doesn't go away. That's still the case. But as a trusted professional, to take the uncertainty, to take the ambivalence in some case around certain things or guidance that has not come out, and to apply it with best judgment and with reasoned thinking is really where the relevance and the value of our profession and the makeup, the DNA of us as individual CPAs really will pay dividends. And how we handle this will be a big statement about how our profession is positioned in the years and decades to come. Because how we deal with this today is a critical component. And I think you will see some of that really will play out. I'd like to give you sort of a sense of how I think firms in general, obviously our members in business, it depends a lot on what business you're in and what size business you're in and where that business is in its own risk matrix. And so it's impossible to be, obviously there's industries that are dramatically impacted negatively and dramatically impacted positively. And so it's harder to really spend this amount of time really focused on those, although in questions or whatever, I'm happy to address some thoughts I might have about those. But really from a public accounting perspective, I'd like to give you a sense. There's a lot of things that get written, and we do a lot of interaction with firm leaders. We focus on the top 8, the top 100, the top 500, the 44,000, predominantly very small firms. And when I speak about PPP, I'm going to tell you the story of PPP, which is about the small business component and why that's so critical. But it also applies to the different sizes of firms out there. And so how are firms doing? Look, I think firms are doing reasonably well. I'll give you an analogy that I've heard in discussing or came to with a bunch of CEOs of firms. This is a little different than the 2008 economic times. If you think about 2008, the lockup of our financial system, the lack of liquidity at a big company perspective, the fact of the matter is it related to our profession, the most intense impact in that time was really in the largest firms and obviously their clients that were in the, really affected by liquidity type of issues. But the larger firms had really significant issues, and we went through some negative economic times, but it didn't cascade down to the smaller business environment quite in the same way. And so big impact at the largest firms, small impact at the smaller firms. Today is almost an inverse of that. It's not a perfect inverse, but it's somewhat of an inverse. Today, if you think about publicly traded companies, global footprint, the capabilities of having been diversified for many of them. Obviously, certain industries that this is not true, but certainly financial services, it probably is true. Technology, it probably is true. Any of the innovation space companies, not hospitality and airlines, of course. But their sort of notion from a compliance perspective, tax compliance, audit compliance, and that they do with those publicly listed companies, it doesn't insulate those firms, but it is somewhat of a buffering. As you get down in the size spectrum, there is more risk. A lot more percentage-wise small businesses actually shut down by government edict or economic circumstances that apply. So the profile, the risk profile, I think skews to smaller firms today versus the larger firms. I would say if we look sort of as the top 1,000 firms, I think generally speaking, those firms have taken some actions. They're probably not as universal actions as some of the, some things that get reported in an internet and things of that nature. But some have certainly done layoffs and some have certainly done pay adjustments. A high percentage of them have certainly affected partner draws and partner investments, liquidity issues inside their firms. through, relying on partners to be able to achieve that. But for the most part, the attitude of the leaders of firms today is that they believe they will be critically important to their clients, and therefore their people, their staffs, are critically important to being able to serve those clients. Now, we all hope that the ramp up will be fairly quick, and that's why they really want to hold on to their people, because their clients, their ability to be that trusted advisor is directly impacted by their ability to have the competencies on their teams, regardless of the size, because it's all relative, but the competencies on their teams to help clients through this. And then, of course, things like the different programs, PPP being the most voluminous one, is clearly things that they need to be doing for their clients. And so firms have tried to I think, position themselves in that type of way. I think, all firms are worried about liquidity and whether their clients will be able to pay them for the work that's being done, and when will the next shoe drop. I think, generally speaking, they've done pretty well today. Now, there's some exceptions, and the way I would say it, there's a huge geography place here. As I've talked to firms, I can pretty much take the Rockies to the Appalachians, and with the exception of a few hot spots in that, in between those two mountain ranges, firms are doing reasonably well. Their clients are in this sort of mid-America, southern, entrepreneurial spirit. Clearly, Detroit's a hot spot. Clearly, Chicago has been a hot spot. Clearly, New Orleans has been a hot spot. The other places have not been at that same intensity as those three in between those two mountain ranges. And when you speak to firms that predominantly operate in that space, their outlook is much more positive from that standpoint. When we get to the two coasts, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. If you're on the coast, for instance, if California has had very significant lockdown rules, state of Washington, Seattle was the first to really experience a lot of what the country as a whole has experienced. So you have a little bit different perspective. You may be a little bit more pessimistic. There are exceptions on the West Coast. If your clientele is just really heavily in the technology space, most of the technology companies are doing very well from that standpoint, and so their clients therefore are doing well. If you're in entertainment and real estate, much harder in those environments, and obviously the hospitality, restaurants, bars, hotels type of environments. On the East Coast, and it pretty much is the entire East Coast. I mean, Miami has been a hot spot, and you can certainly go all the way up, certainly to Boston. You get a little bit of different take, in some of the like main areas, but the East Coast has got sort of, it's a tale of two cities, or two stories, if you will. If you have clientele that's heavily into the financial services area, and certainly New York and Boston and the DC area have huge financial services components and related activities, that is so critical to recovery that they've been a little bit less impacted. But then a lot of the other things that have been so tremendously shut down, much like Metro Detroit, becomes more problematic from a client perspective. I think generally firms have been pretty happy about how they've adjusted as it relates to work from home. I saw a statistic in the top 100, for instance, 98% felt like they had done that very well. One CEO told me, it wasn't a top 100 but top 500 firm. He said, it was really funny. I've been trying to get our tax team to work virtually for the last 4 years, and they had all these reasons why they couldn't do it. But interestingly, they figured out how to do it in 48 hours as we were going through this. I thought that was sort of a little bit of levity on thinking about it, but it sort of told a story about necessity being the mother of invention. And clearly, I think firms have adapted to this very well, all size firms. And in many instances, smaller firms might have been even more equipped to be able to do it, certainly firms that were cloud focused early on. I think we've been seeing a very significant element of a movement to cloud-based services. Through CPA.com, that's been a big emphasis for more than a decade now. You've heard many of you have talked about that in the top 100 firms, what we call CAS services, client advisory services, that are cloud-based, now constitutes on average about 10% of their revenue base, when a decade ago it was 0%. And so that's a pretty big shift when you're looking at the 100 largest firms. And but the story is that when you look at firms, there are some that have embraced that and some that have not. We're clearly seeing the firms that have not embraced that rapidly run to embracing it in their business operations today. And the firms that have embraced it have a mixed story with their clients. They have some clients that have certainly embraced it, and they had some clients that were not. And we're seeing even those what I'd call embracing or previously embracing firms have really seen an uptick from their clients in that particular sort of commitment, if you will. And so we're seeing this rapid movement to a more virtual relationship in that space. And I think that will be here forever, frankly. And I think when we've talked about the technological impacts to our profession, like robotics and artificial intelligence, blockchain and the like that comes about, we've been talking about for years, the manifestation of COVID-19 will actually make those things that we've been talking about happen quicker to our profession. So this is not a time to say, well, compliance has brought me and, I still got the audit and tax work, thank God I have for that. Yes, thank God you have that. But it doesn't turn down the change management dial as to where our profession is going. And I really think that's another very important takeaway, because the technology adaptation that's happening is actually going to fuel that, I believe, going forward in a much more significant way. Obviously, so let's talk a little bit about the path forward, but I wanted to just give you a sense of the profession. I'm going to come back to a couple other points on the human capital side here in a little bit. Let me speak a little bit about where we've seen the tax, not just tax, but the issues forward, both U.S. and globally, and then go into a bit more detail. First off, the first main issue for us was tax. We were staring at April 15th, really, a March 15th, and then an April 15th deadline. It was sort of an interesting process. We actually had a lot of our members, when we took the position to move the tax deadline from April 15th to July 15th, really not happy with us on that point. Oh, no, don't do that. That deadline keeps things moving for me and helps me manage my clients. I'm sure none of you listening to this were in that group. No one will admit that now. But the fact is that there was a lot of firms that were pushing back from that standpoint, and I understand it. But we knew that was not the right answer, given where this was going, and that we had to do something. And it really came in two stages. I have to say, just up front, as it relates to tax, the IRS is working at about 20% capacity right now. So there's obviously frustration out there. The IRS cannot work at home in the same way that a firm can or your business can. There are all sorts of taxpayer confidentiality issues that are just phenomenally difficult to think about when you start bringing, their type of workforce, which is a very dispersed and very variant workforce, different types of skills and things, into a work-at-home environment. And actually, IRS workers are unionized, and they've had to manage through union expectations and the like. So it's been very difficult for the IRS. But as it related to the April 15th issue and moving into July 15th, all indications were that the IRS totally agreed with us. And in fact, we made a lot of points about the IRS capacity to deal with things was a really critical component. We actually had some trouble getting sort of an en masse issue. And I will acknowledge there were some legitimacies to those concerns. Secretary Mnuchin was very direct, and his office with us was very direct. That the Secretary, again, put us back into, March 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th type of time frame. The Secretary was very committed to having as many people who had refunds due on their returns file timely as possible, because he felt, and he was right, that he wanted that money to be part of the economic recovery stimulus. It took us ultimately, the state societies were fantastic. It took us ultimately, to use grassroots pressure to really say this is not the right answer. And ultimately, the Secretary set policy by tweet. He tweeted the movement from April 15th to July 15th. And I don't tweet a lot. I don't like setting policy through tweet or having over impact on things through tweet. That's just, there are some ramifications by who tweets and how. We certainly see that play out with political leaders today. But the fact of the matter is I did follow his policy by tweet back with a statement encouraging all firms to encourage clients that were due refunds to file timely, but with the acknowledgement that that couldn't happen for every refund return. The problem, of course, is when he did the tweet policy by tweet, it wasn't all encompassing, and there was a whole host of other returns that fell in, including estimated taxes, let's say a June 15th estimated tax, even though the return was July 15th. Very complicated stuff. And ultimately, we again were able to push that over the finish line, where we got a ruling, a guidance from the IRS that said everything that was due from that March 15th, 16th, 17th time frame to July 15th was extended to July 15th. It was essential. And, frankly, we're dealing with the issue of what about July 15th to October 15th, because, there's still a lot of uncertainty. And we think a wholesale sort of blanket July 15th to October 15th, unless things get worse, instead of the gradual startup of the economy, if things got worse, what I'm going to say might not be applicable. But with the startup of the economy, I think there's going to be a hesitancy to go from July 15th en masse to some other date, October 15th. That doesn't mean that you, as a practitioner, can't extend on an individual basis to October 15th, as would normally be the case, but the mechanics of actually filing a return come into play from that standpoint. So or filing an extension, I should say. And so that is that's the likely outcome. And I think it is part about restarting the economy in that space. Small business was a big component. I'm going to come to PPP on the next slide. But what we made a decision was, internally, was that the big major industry verticals, the airlines, the hotels, they were going to be taken care of in the thinking process of Washington, D.C. But we were really concerned about the engine of our economy, which is the small business economy. And the tens of millions of small businesses that are out there, and we said we're going to be as much focused in that space as we can, because we think our voice in this and how we can represent the voice of the 44,000 firms is critical. And the fact is that the 10 million or so small businesses that have employees, almost every one of those businesses has a CPA relationship, and so our voice is and was very critical component of how this is looked at, and we really took a focal point on that. I would say, as you know, we have a global footprint. That has been the case throughout the world. As we have worked, for instance, with the UK government, the Malaysian government, etc., with our teams on the ground there. And so it has been a universal notion. I will tell you, the U.S. small business environment, we're a consumption-based economy, you might say, an excessive consumption-based economy. And that notion of that being fueled from small business is a critical component to recovery. In fact, it's a critical component not only to the U.S. economy recovery, but because of our insatiable appetite to consume as Americans, it's a huge element to the global economy as well. And so that was sort of the major thinking process that we had in that environment. And so clearly keeping people up to date, real time, even with lack of clarity in many instances, drove our whole sort of information set, our COVID-19 information set, just the incredible amount of resources that we have been able to put forward. And frankly, the member response to it has been just phenomenal. We've had other organizations link our material, other national organizations link our material, other international organizations link our material, as it relates to just this sort of, our team has just been phenomenal in the ability to push this out there, to gather it, to understand it, and then to put it out there in a very serious way. And I'm very proud of how our team has approached. We have certainly not been perfect, and no one can be perfect in this environment. But I think the response has been phenomenal. We do, for instance, on PPP, we do weekly seminars, town halls, we call them, that have thousands and thousands and thousands of people participating on them, just to get the current, just the absolute, up to the minute type of information. And we bring outsiders in to express views from different perspectives. Now that leads me to the PPP program. And I will just take a few minutes here. I think it's very important for all of you to understand. First off, let's put it in context. As I said, our focus was on small business. What we were articulating, and again, it was only a little bit over a month ago. It feels like about 5, 6, 7 years ago, but it was just a few months, just a month or so ago, about 5, 6 weeks ago actually. And what we began to articulate very directly to Congress, and this particular bill was led in the Senate, was that if you were focused, which you should be focused on the small business environment, you had to think differently about it. And the key factors we said was, look, it has to be fast. It has to be something that I would say what bailout for small business would occur. They don't use that term, but if you think about bailouts of industries in the past, think of small business as an industry vertical unto itself. And so the financial resources of the federal government to buttress that particular area. We said it has to be fast. It can't be overly red tape oriented. And you sort of have a choice to make. You can either think about all the protections you want to put and the rigor that you want to put. That will by definition not be fast when you're talking about millions, 10 millions, 30 million when you include businesses that do not have employees. So that won't meet the fast test. And the exchange for fast means that you're going to have more imperfections, you're going to have more uncertainty, but that's the trade-off in that issue. So fast versus sort of the perfection. Our staff gets tired of hearing it, but I always say the pursuit of perfection is the enemy of progress. Fast progress, we said, was critically important. We also said that it had to have a grant notion, not just the typical disaster relief grant notion. It had to have a more massive grant notion. We could call it forgiveness. That's the term that's being used now. But we said entrepreneurs are not going to want to be signing loans, very rapidly. Again, on the fast point, entrepreneurs, small business operators are going to be hesitant to do that because they're going to be thinking about, how do I pay this back? How can I afford to pay this back? Will that affect my ability for this business to survive? It's sort of the ability to survive now or the ability to not be able to pay back the loan. And people are very sensitive to that if you're an entrepreneur. How you manage debt is a very critical component of an important component of a small business person's mindset. And so we said that had to be a very strong component. We actually said the target it needed to be on small businesses with 100 or less employees. The Senate ultimately decided to make that 500. We said that we thought the appropriate cutoff would have been around 100 for a program that ultimately became the PPP and what was being discussed. And so ultimately we had a lot of influence there. We'll never get credit for it. That's not important. But we did have a lot of influence in this being a forgiveness, being fast. And we could have taken a self-serving interest. We could have said, no, you ought to have financial information and financial reports and a whole lot of calculations as it relates to a small business taking that. And we said, no, that's not the right answer if you think economic recovery. It's got to be fast. And oh, by the way, Congress, there's going to be errors. There's going to be abuses. It's not going to be perfect. And we were very clear in saying that to our members as this program first was enacted. It actually was very fast. It could have been even faster if the decisions on unemployment might have been a little different. But there was a convergence of timing where government was shutting down activities like restaurants. The original idea was, okay, government's going to shut down restaurants. We're going to give restaurants money to pay their payroll. Don't let the people go to unemployment. We're going to give people money. It's going to be forgiven. Keep your people. We understand they may not have much to do, but keep your people. Keep the small business operating for this 60-day, later became 8 weeks, 8-week period of time while we get through this shutdown process, and then the economy is going to be ready to go. That was the concept of what was envisioned. Now, unfortunately, as part of the legislative process, not unfortunately from the recipient standpoint, but unfortunately the unemployment supplement changed some of the economics of that. And it took a little bit longer than what anybody really wanted to get the PPP program up and running. In actuality, the extended through PPP today, approaching $600 billion, basically 2/3 of $1 trillion with millions of loans. It was set up to go through the SBA as opposed to any place else, which added a little bit of confusion in the process. But more than 5,000 financial institutions working to execute on the loans, millions of loans, the vast majority to small businesses, and basically 2/3 of $1 trillion put out into the economy through this process. Basically, in 4 weeks, the amount of loans that were processed would equal 40 years of activity from the SBA. Just an incredible effort. And while people complained about banks, it was handed to them. And we did a lot of video. I did a lot of video saying, look, we understand the pressures they're under, and they don't want to be second guessed later. And so we have to understand that it's difficult for them to execute as well and to make it happen as best as we could. Now, a couple of key components. Our original recommendation to the Congress, which was not adopted, was to do this through payroll. We said the most accurate information is the payroll processors of this country. There's actually a concentration probably of about 50 that the predominance of all small businesses use for paying their payroll. It's more than 50 if you add people that do a very small number, and some people still write their own checks. And they would have had to have been alternative processors for that. But we said, think about it. Those payroll processors, they know the companies exist. They're real because they're processing people's payroll every 2 weeks or whatever. They're getting checks from them. They know that in most cases the checking accounts of the individual employees because it's electronically deposited. We have these sort of built-in checks and balances by using the payroll processors from that standpoint. And we actually built a coalition to articulate that point. Literally a coalition that we built, and I'll show you a slide on that in a moment, in about 36 hours over a weekend with just an incredible effort to pull that through, to try to really explain to Congress that this was the way to go. Because of the loan and the forgiveness process, they decided to go through SBA, and obviously we shifted to working with them. Now, there was not a lot of guidance. Now, by design, there was not a lot of guidance. And we obviously issued guidance, and I'm happy to answer in the Q&A things on the agent issues and signing the form. But really, pretty simply, it was a self-assessment by the entrepreneur that says that this company is being impacted by this current uncertainty of economic times. Pretty low bar by design. Why? Because the concept was to get the money out to the small businesses by design so that you could affect employment, get the money to the people. And the rules for forgiveness heavily skewed to payroll. Again, why? Because the objective was to flow the money to the individual employees. And so ultimately, when we were looking for guidance on the application, we felt there needed to be some guidance, but still very high level. Treasury, they were doing a lot of things, well-meaning people looking at all kind of different programs. We ultimately issued guidance, recommendations we called them, without the government's sort of stamp of approval on them. Sort of some winks and nods that we were probably in the right spot. And we had the coalition weigh in to see if we thought we had any glaring errors or whatever, because we tried to give that guidance as quickly as we could. And we were successful. Ultimately, the Treasury adopted rules that were very similar to what we had communicated to the profession as a whole. It was a huge risk on our part because we could have been, 180 degrees from what the Treasury ultimately decided to do, and that would have been a big problem. And so that leads us to where PPP is today. And there's been some high-profile things where some public companies and some others have taken PPP money, and sort of the moral outrage kicks in from people about whether that should be the case or not. And that has become a big media issue. Now, I will say that we did a video very early on in the process, Eric Oscarson and I from CPA.com, and we told firms as part of their trusted advisor role, they should advise their clients this is going to be made public. This was before the switch was even flipped for the money to flow. That this was going to be public, either through freedom of information or other means, and the public relations aspect should be considered. That's some of the risk management you should consider in applying. But consider it. It shouldn't thwart truly needy people who were impacted outcomes from that standpoint. There's been some guidance that has come out. We have a matrix that's out on the forgiveness, a tool that we're ready to push out. We're still waiting on true guidance from the Treasury. There are some wide disparities of what that guidance might be. And so it's it's sort of beyond our ability to just take the risk and put that out there. Although we have given our answers to the government, we haven't gotten the government to actually adopt all of those. At some point, if they just cannot ever get to them, we'll probably do that as well. There's a few things that we have lobbied for. We think that the start date on the 8 weeks needs to be changed. And we've been very vocal on that with Congress. There's trade groups that are lobbying for all sorts of things. Changing the 8 weeks to 16 weeks, changing a June 30th date to December 31st, counting not just the 4 categories of expenses, but any type of expense. We think those are not going to get enacted very easily by Congress, but we did think that the 8-week start date was a problem, that given the timing of the program, your 8 weeks to make the test for forgiveness started when you were funded. That was the rule. One of the things we said is you don't split payroll. Start using the payroll that's closest to that date. We've issued that recommendation. But the other thing is that we felt if you were shut down, that was the wrong interpretation of the intent of the law. That if you were shut down by government rule, that's not the entrepreneur's decision to shut down, that the start date should actually begin when government gives you the green light to operate again. We think that's a much fairer outcome, and it is consistent with the recovery to the economy. That was the intent of this program. Now, in this process, the Treasury, under pressure, because of some of the high-profile issues, did issue a question and answer that said, that addressed liquidity. That implied, well, maybe if you had liquidity, you shouldn't be eligible for PPP. It wasn't specific. It just said you have to consider liquidity without any definition of liquidity. Now, immediately, I will tell you, and probably people in this room have asked this question, we need guidance on what do they mean by liquidity, because we want to know the answer to that. Now, I would just tell you, and look, answers can come at any moment, and there are rumors that answers will come at any moment. But I will tell you that answering that question, no matter how it's answered, will in fact cause a lot of small businesses to be disqualified. I could take the 5 smartest of you in this room and put you in a room, or in this virtual room, and put you in a different virtual room and say, let's come up with the definition of liquidity as a test at inception, now a month ago, 6 weeks ago, for application of the PPP loans. You come up with a definition of liquidity. And no matter how smart you are, if you come up with some, rational definition, we're going to exclude a lot of small businesses and have an expectation of them paying back. And there will be unintended consequences to that. Companies that paid their payroll, they'll be out of pocket. They'll do that, and then they'll do another round of layoffs. That is not the intent of this program. So I'm actually hopeful that we as CPAs can apply some judgment in this particular process. And I've heard all sorts of examples. I heard an example of a hotelier, a small business owner of a hotel. The hotel shut down. They've kept their employees on because they got a PPP loan. They have a very strong balance sheet, fairly unusual for a hotel, and they have several $1 million of cash on their balance sheet and no debt. And, the CEO of the firm is talking to me and says, well, do you think Treasury is going to pass a rule that says that this is a liquidity problem? And I said, let's step back. If we step back and we are that entrepreneur, here we are, we own a hotel, it's shut down, I've got, let's just say, $10 million on my asset side, no debt. I'm sitting here in this environment. I have no idea when I'm going to be able to have customers and revenue come back in through my hotel. What is going to be the rational entrepreneur decision-making process? I think it's going to be that I need that $10 million to help start this business back up and help it survive going forward. If I don't have those PPP funds, I'm going to lay off people. That's what the entrepreneur's decision is going to be. I need to preserve that liquidity so that I can make this business survive into the future, the uncertain future. Instead, that hotel took PPP money, and they kept and have kept, and still to today have kept, their employees. Obviously, it's not an operating hotel on payroll. These are people that are not on the unemployment lines. And so, if you think about it, that's a good example. Clearly, $10 million, if that's the number, and I'm changing the facts to protect the innocent, that's a liquidity situation. And so does that mean that this company should pay back their PPP loan and weren't eligible with retrospect? And I think if you go to the intent of the program, the intent of what Congress did, then I think you conclude no, that this company should not pay back the PPP loans. They've kept their people on. They've done what was in the best interest of the economy as a whole. That's my opinion, based on a lot of input from a lot of people, obviously. But I think we have to hope for the intent to still be the focal point of this program. Just one other point, the IRS has determined that at this point, against that intent, that the expenses against PPP loans are not deductible. And I know tax people in the room will say, well, from an equity perspective and from a philosophy perspective, there's a lot of precedent of that in the tax law. I get it. And if there's might even be, based on your political persuasion, you might think, well, the government's got to, deal with deficits, et cetera. I get that as well. If we go to the intent was to support small business. And the intent actually was, and the Senate is weighing in on a bipartisan way, and there will be legislation offered to go back to the deductibility if Secretary Mnuchin doesn't change that particular position. Whether it passes, who knows? I think it's a reasonable chance it will pass, because the intent was, no, we're going to give the financial support, and if this creates NOLs and tax benefit, that's just another aid in helping the small business survive. And so I would just encourage us again to think about this from the standpoint of intent. Just a couple of things on exams to just shift off of PPP, and I'm happy to answer questions on it. I could, as you can tell, probably speak for the next, day and a half on PPP. On CPA exam, the test centers were closed back May 1. They're back open with, distancing rules, so volume is impacted. But we're back up and working. We are looking at long-term whether there are more biometrics capabilities to allow internet-based testing and the like in a high-stakes exam like the CPA exam. It's not fully cooked to be able to do that with an exam like CPA exam yet, but this was already in the process, but it's not yet cooked from that standpoint. Our CGMA exams, actually, we have the ability to do remote proctoring, and we've been able, we're the only professional accountancy body in the world that's been able to shift, at least for part of our process, the CGMA exams, which is predominantly in the rest of the world. We are offering them in a virtual way, and it's going very well. So just to give you a sense of this sort of moving forward, we have been very focused on the stakeholder management process, the government, the business advisors, which are the firms, and trying to really impact that. Obviously, our members in industry are the target of a lot of this, and so we've done a lot of work communicating with our members in industry. We've brought, the coalition together, the payroll processors, people that deal with tax forms, the tax processors, the technology people, other data technology companies, because that all affects the ability for business and business advisors to execute on this. And we have been very closely connected with large national banks as well as the banking representative groups, ABA type, talking with that. FinTech lenders, which were stood up in the PPP process. We have had tentacles into all of these different environments. Frankly, I think some banks have learned, some CPA firms have learned that with their local community banks, they probably needed to build better relationships, and that probably is on the to-do moving forward. To, as you think about engaging in stakeholders, because they might have had a better time with some of their clients if that was true in that particular environment. But we've tried to manage it thinking in this context of these four boxes. I said I would just mention the funding, the Small Business Funding Coalition that we put together. We meet with this group. We were meeting twice a week, and now I think we're at a once a week environment. Some of the stuff that we were taking positions on, we would share from a fatal flaw perspective. Some of the stuff we would do jointly. We have led this. It's an AICPA-led coalition. You can see big name players, Paychex, ADP, Intuit type of franchise association, and a lot of technology based, some of which you may not know, but they have big footprints in the business center and the business environment because their technology providers in this particular space. Now let me shift to, with the time that we have remaining, to the issues of services, talent, and reputation and influence, and just to give you some things to think about in this space. Number one of the things that we have not slowed down is our project called DAS, Dynamic Audit Solution. That's on the right-hand side of this slide. This is the project that we're doing with a consortium of monetary support with some of the larger firms. The idea is to reinvent the audit from scratch using technology. How would we create the audit today using the modern technologies that are out there? We actually think this is even more important than it was even a year ago or 18 months ago when this started. We actually think the willingness to embrace it will be greater going forward than what we might have even imagined. And the project is essentially on track. It is actually a project that has been using a lot of human resources from a lot of different firms in a virtual way, predominantly in a virtual way, even prior to COVID-19. It continues to be a priority. It continues to be worked on. On the left-hand side, it is about the real-world issues of today. How do you conduct an audit when you can't visit a client? What are the ways to comply with the audit and assurance standards? What are some of the implications to accounting standards? Some of the accounting standards have been delayed with pressure of Congress and the like, so CECL in the financial institutions area. How do you do an inventory observation? What things should you think about from a risk perspective when you're doing alternative procedures to overcome that? Or if you, for the first time, using drone technology to observe inventories and things of that nature. Early on, we did a series of webinars on this particular space with different topics in each one. They sold out, frankly, and not as in just the capacity sold out. In other words, they were essentially free, but we had capacity limitations. We recorded them. They've been available online. We're still getting a lot of questions. We're providing resources in this space. If you're auditing in this space, I think you need to refer to this information. It'll help you think through the things that you might not have thought through before. But firms are executing audits fairly well in this environment. I'm not saying there's some degradation of efficiency. Yes, I'm sure. But we are proving this. In many instances, what I'm hearing from firms, it's actually the client's capabilities that are more of a timing implication than really the ability of the firms to execute. And so I would just say that is a critical component in that area. A whole host of things in the trusted advisor area. First off, lots of other SBA programs. The EIDL program, which is disaster relief, might not be top of mind. Main Street lending for larger companies. There's probably going to be a CARES 4 package, which is going to we're actually providing input on a white paper that's being circulated now as to how can larger types of companies, how can the government help them, what would be effective from lending and credit programs. We've actually offered an idea on an accounts receivable factoring program that the government could help make sure liquidity is in the marketplace. There are going to be a lot of activities. Clearly, firms are doing a lot of advice on how to maximize the forgiveness of the payroll protection program. I would say on the left-hand side here, business models are critical. If you're not familiar with the notions of how to advise on business model, a lot of the work we've done in CGMA, there's a lot of free guidance out there, and really helping your client, or if you work in business and industry, helping your company think through what truly is our business model. Where is value created? What do we and what can we and should we be emphasizing? How can we make modifications in a very thoughtful business model notion, not on an intuitive way. Intuition is important, but more of a formalized way of thinking about this and hopefully making the right types of decisions. So I call your attention to that. On the right-hand side, obviously the cloud technologies, cybersecurity, huge work that firms are doing for clients in this area, a heightened awareness of these. I think not-for-profits, by the way, 501c6s are not included in the PPP program. We have lobbied for that. We have actually, with an organization called ASAE, been the lead of that. There is a chance it's bipartisan support for it. There is a chance in the next go around for that. There is also some employee credit programs out there that might be beneficial for state-based not-for-profits. 501c6s are a little bit politically dicey because they do lobby. We have actually suggested maybe the answer should be just state-based, state and local-based not-for-profits or 501c6s, not nationals, and so that government doesn't get into this notion of all of the national organizations that are lobbying for different things right now and also providing funding from that. It's sort of a conflict of interest issue. So that's a big one. I think local government is a big one. Local government revenues or state and local government are very significantly and maybe permanently impacted. And I think a lot of firms are focusing on this as an opportunity to do business transformation advisory. We know local governments are not always the most efficient or technologically astute, well-meaning, but never having the political will or the resources to do things. But this may be a catalyst to say we have to be more efficient. We have to provide technology and use technology in different ways. We have to not be redundant. And a lot of the firms, certainly the firms in the top 100 group, I think are focused on this in a lot of ways. And I think that will be an ongoing opportunity. Healthcare restructuring, hospital restructuring, huge issues. Physicians different, more impacted. Physicians and support personnel more impacted. But the hospitals will probably survive, but there's going to probably be some business transformation stuff that needs to go in that space. So that's just some ideas that we've been hearing pretty consistently. Fraud will be an element of this. There's already been some fraud identified in PPP. And when I talk about judgment, that's different than fraud. The fraud is people making up businesses that don't exist and applying for money. There will be a lot of those types of things where people will have opportunities, economic damages, clearly, unfortunately, bankruptcies in that space. The whole valuation part of our profession will be an emphasis point, I think, going forward. And then even the systems of controls. We're going to see even more concern. We just produced some more guidance on supply chain controls and supply chain management. As you know, we have a special assurance service on cyber. We think that will get a lot more play as the cyber risk, as companies operate more in a cyber environment, I think will rise in very significant areas. On the personal and on the financial and tax planning areas, maybe the greatest opportunity, certainly on the notion of tax and financial planning in this environment and different generation, plenty of tax opportunities and estate planning opportunities, valuations being down, new opportunities from a trust perspective, very sophisticated stuff in play. We're continuing to provide a lot of guidance on this, and we do think that it's one in which a lot of firms, as they were talking about repositioning their tax structures, this is probably a point in time to really look at this in a holistic way going forward as well. And the finance professionals, maybe called upon them more so than anything else. I'll remind you of our CGMA framework that came out of what we call our Future of Finance work. And if you see, technical skills are only about 20% of that wheel, with digital leadership, people, and business skills. You can wrap risk in there too. Ethics, integrity, and professionalism obviously is the key thing that we bring as professionals to the table. But who would argue today that these business skills, people skills, and leadership skills and digital skills aren't a substantive part of what needs to be brought to the table versus just the technical accounting and auditing skills? And I think that applies, and we believe this applies on the public accounting side as well. And I think it just points to a lot of the things that we have been building and embedding into the profession as being right to deal with a very unfortunate fact pattern. Talent size. This is survey work from business leaders, flexibility and agility and adaptability being the most rewardable skill set, the number one skill set businesses want. You can look at this. This was a 2018 response of 5,600 executives from around the world. I would say if you did that survey right now, those three attributes would be very high. So, there's a message there to our profession. Why we bring, we have this incredible advantage. We can bring the discipline. We can bring the understanding of the detail. We can bring the discipline of the decision making around that. But if we can add to that the adaptability and agility skills that really people want, man, we're going to be like the best positioned set of people possible. And I really hope that organization leaders and stuff can really focus on that particular issue. We've talked about the need to unlearn so that we can relearn. Well, there's certainly a lot of proof in that as well today. You know, the notion of what we need to unlearn about, say, rigid definitions on applications for PPP loans and the applicability instead of judgment in a much different way. That's about unlearning biases and how we act and learning new things. And then a whole host of opportunities and tax laws and support programs and business models. And so the ability to relearn today, which means letting go of some things, has never been more important. And frankly, we've done a lot to change who we are. Essentially well over half of our conferences have been converted to virtual. Likely by the end of the year, probably all will be. The social distancing create a problem. We have conferences with 1,500, 2,000, 5,000 people. You don't, we'd have to do it in, the University of Michigan football stadium in order to be able to, have enough space to keep people 6 feet apart in every direction. It's a real problem. And until, vaccines and things of that nature are accepted, or at least treatments are accepted, it is unlikely that we're going to see those. So we've converted conferences, a whole host of programs, webcasts, real-time information flows, and they've been incredibly well received by our membership. We think that will continue. We think firms will invest in virtual training as there's up and downs in work responsibilities today. We think this will become pretty close to a new norm, maybe not a totally new norm. Conferences will come back because that sort of relationship building is critically important, but clearly a new norm from this standpoint. As it relates to the future of the profession, one of the things, again, we have not slowed down is this notion we've called CPA evolution. We know the body of knowledge has changed. Technology has to be in. I've discussed this with you. Other presenters that have been to Michigan in the past year, we've had more than 2,000 places of input. We've had multiple discussions with our council, and we will ask our council to approve a resolution, and NASBA's board will be asked to approve a resolution basically in the next 45 days, and to move this project forward. It will be a multi-year project to make the changes. We anticipate beginning of 2024, January 1, 2024. I like to say December 31, 2023. It just sounds better. Will be where this, this evolution will hopefully take place. And it's fundamentally to bring technology in and to think about our profession with three disciplines. Those disciplines being accounting and auditing. That's been there from day one. Tax hasn't always been there from day one, but it's been there a long time. And the third now, this technology acumen that's necessary even in our core services, attest and assurance and tax as an example. And so this technological innovation and the demands in the marketplace are not changing. They're probably going to accelerate. And how do we evolve the licensing process of CPAs so that the people come in are CPAs, they're part of our profession, they're hired by firms, and they bring the needed disciplines and skill sets to the table into the future. And so the model is essentially this. Instead of just saying that our predominant testing is about accounting and auditing and tax and regs, that we need to think of the third leg of that stool, tech. And what we need to do is have a core that we can test all the basics in all these areas, and then a candidate, they can take one of the disciplines, but everybody comes out as a CPA on the other end the same. But their education, their interest, how they apply their knowledge, once they go to work, is critically component. And so you would still will be a 4-part exam. It'll still test the same number of hours, but it's a reconfiguration. Everyone will take the core, including people who might be coming from a tax perspective and have maybe a little bit less dive in detailed accounting and auditing. They may not know how to do a complex, business consolidation, or they may not know derivatives accounting, but they'll bring other skill set to the table. And we have to be able to deal with the explosion in our traditional disciplines and bring that down, and then allow us to do detailed training or testing in those areas while also bringing technology into the definition. And so it's a strong core with accounting, auditing, tax, and technology, deeper knowledge in the three disciplines, one CPA license, enhances adaptivity and flexibility of our profession. It models something very close to what's the engineering licensing model. We're hand in glove with the NASBA folks. We had good feedback from our council, and in 2 weeks or a week and a half, our council will be asked to pass a resolution of support to move this forward after about 2 years of work. And as I said, it'll have a multiple year implementation as you change the exam and you educate with universities. And brings me to the university component of our pipeline. And look, we all know universities in the world of hurt. We're seeing there'll be many universities that probably go bankrupt. The ability to bring students back is being debated. Some are stepping out now and doing that. Resources, huge issues, dorm rooms, paying bonds on those dorm rooms. But as it relates to our profession, one of the things that we were seeing is a slight downtick in interest in accounting programs. Now, why was that happening? Well, one was because of the demand side, because technology wasn't part of it. They were hiring fewer students with traditional accounting and auditing and tax skills, and more with pure technology. CP Evolution addresses that. But on the student side, students are smart, and they were hearing a lot and seeing a lot of how technology will impact our profession. And while the profession was looked at this stable place that I could have a great career for a lifelong of work, well, will it be that way in the future? Will it be that way for me as a high school student, and should I think differently? Well, this sort of crisis will, we believe, change that. We think when you step back, you will see firms having done pretty well. Firms are pretty much, living up to their student offers. They're living up to their intern programs to a large degree. That image of the profession will be very powerful to high school students as they think about where they go with their university education in the next year and 2 years. We think it's a critical role for state societies. We think, communicating that. We have the high school honors program now and academic champions. Obviously, we have work to do. Again, state societies can be leaders on that at the university level as they evolve to meet the new vision for CPA with the CPA Evolution Project. But we think we have an incredibly positive story to tell at the high school level and at the university level. It always was positive. We think it actually may be more positive when you combine how well the profession we think will do in this crisis and the CPA Evolution Project. And so that's a very powerful situation. Those of you who know me, you would know that you're not going to get away with listening to me, even if it's virtual, and not have at least a word about diversity in our profession, advancement of women, etc. We have great programs on the advancement of women. We have made progress as a profession. We still have work to do. The percentage of women who are equity owners in firms needs to increase. Again, I am not taking away from the progress that has been made, but it needs to be, in the top of the thinking for leaders of firms and the like. Likewise, on ethnic diversity, underrepresented minorities remain a problem as to the numbers. And then inclusion remains an issue that has to be focused upon, including unconscious bias. And if there is shrinkage going on, we need to be very cognizant that we do not have unconscious bias in how we determine who are the best performers we want to stay with and keep in our firm and those that are not. And also, frankly, as we talk about the high school and college programs, critical components from a minority perspective, economic ownership will be diverse. It is growing and growing as to the amount of diversity in that. Our profession has to continue to reflect that. And so we're committed to supporting members in each of these areas. We will continue to build the resource centers. We will continue to keep that up to date. We'll continue to be leaders and to take leadership positions on these programs, and including if we have members that get displaced. We now have probably the most powerful global job connectivity process, and it is global with, as you can see, more than 600,000 jobs listed in that we have been able to position as we've come together on a global stage. A very powerful option if you know someone who is facing those issues. And finally, I just want to call our attention to the firms. That one of the things we have not slowed down is .cpa. We now own .cpa. We have a program to bring that out for a digital identity of firms, licensed CPA firms. It ultimately will be global. It has to be global by definition of how the internet works. But there will be opportunities first in the United States, and people will be able to protect, for the most part, their intellectual brands, particularly if they have IP associated with it. That will roll out, in the summer, in the latter part of the summer. I know we're entering the summer. We delayed it. We were going to roll that out after tax season. For obvious reasons, we delayed it. Be on the lookout for that. If you run a firm, put this on your list to be on the lookout for. This is coming. There are procedures and processes through that, and we think it will be a very important component going forward. I said last thing, I missed the slide here. On the tax side, we have put together, you may have seen just last week on Friday, a series of recommendations to aid small business in the tax area. We're continuing to do a lot of work on the local area. You're going to see a lot of pressures for tax on the local area. In the things that we've recommended, there are things like, looking at the state the deductibility of business taxes from a state and local perspective. Clarification of home office deduction rules, because obviously that's going to be a big issue. Some AMT points that we think are very important to be addressed in this situation that could have unintended consequences. Some different definitions in 199A. Those are probably the ones on the top of the list, along with the deductibility of the PPP role. So, in wrapping this up, we have been through, obviously, the personal health part, the shutdown. How do you do that? We worked really hard to have firms be essential capabilities. We've been into these major programs of business relief, both the applicability and now the forgiveness and compliance part, the trusted advisor role, and really how we leverage that moving into the future about how we really, as a profession, lead the restart and the re-recovery of our economies, particularly led by, we think, small business, which will be critical. So thank you all for listening. I look forward after the break to doing Q&A with you, and I thank you for all your support and feedback. We've had a lot of interaction with members. I want to again wish Bob all the best. Tough circumstances to be starting in, so we're here for you as well. And just remember that opening part. This is a point in time. This is a point in time for our profession to really be that profession that helps drive this recovery. Thank you very much.